You're listening to the Getting Smart podcast. I'm Mason Pashia. I recently asked Benjamin Freud, today's guest, to write us a blog on the biomimicry for regenerative design lab at Green School Bali, where he is head of upper school. The blog he sent over was great, full of insights, and it made me want to go deeper on some of the more confrontational points. I want to frame our conversation today with three distinct laws or observations about the world. So one of these was provided me from Benjamin, which is the idea of change without change. It's a concept in physics that Benjamin brought to my attention, which says you can alter how you describe something mathematically, but the actual outcomes remain exactly the same. Another one is Goodhart's law, which is when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. And lastly, I wanted to bring Audre Lorde into the conversation. The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. So I'm holding those three observations and laws as we kind of navigate the conversation today. We're going to try and tackle two incredibly tricky questions as North Stars for our conversation. One of them, which I also recently discussed with Will Richardson on the podcast, is what does a school or organization that truly changes the system look like? And the question that I often use as my own North Star, to paraphrase one of the core biomimicry design principles, what would it mean for a school system to create conditions conducive to life? Our guest today, Benjamin Freud, PhD, is head of upper school for Green School Bali, the co-founder of Coconut Thinking, and has years of experience in international schools, PBL, school leadership, and more. He's also one of my top 5 favorite people to follow on LinkedIn, where the comment section is an emergent space. Benjamin, welcome.
Hi, good morning or good afternoon to you.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for being here. For those not watching video, you are missing out. Benjamin is at the school, and it is beautiful and a fascinating place. So, Benjamin, I've always been curious about this. You're someone who is incredibly intentional with your language. You always use it to better orient yourself among all the other living things on this planet. As a poet and lover of poetry, I really appreciate this intentionality around language. Where does that instinct come from for you?
That's a very good question. And the language part is something I really struggle with, actually. And I'd even say that I really am interested in this idea of contradictions that are complementary, right?
Hmm.
And like, so I think I've read, I think in Ian McGilchrist's book or something, who got it from someone, this idea that like the real things that we deal with and grapple with in life, you could hold different truths that are oppositional. It's those insipid, superficial truths that really are black and white. So language is something that is intentional. Words really mean a lot. I love etymology, the roots of words. At the same time, I also know language is just nothing but something that limits our thinking. It's something that frames our thinking in ways that make us misunderstood. Words themselves are never quite that useful, and they'll never get to the thoughts that we actually have under the words. So the language is something to play with. It's a game in many ways, one that we have to take with irony, but at the same time, it's so very important in order to really get at precision. So we dance this two things of language is actually unhelpful while at the same time being super helpful.
Yeah, one of my favorite books of all time is Spell of the Sensuous by David
Mhm.
Abram, where he spends a lot of time really thinking about our evolution of language and how that's been a distancing mechanism from the rest of the world. So, highly recommend to
That's
our
right.
listeners if any of this has piqued your interest so far. On the subject of language, I think you have really helped push my thinking on the distinguishing factors between regenerative and sustainable. I think that those two words oftentimes get kind of like thrown into a bucket together. Can you help break that down for our audience a little bit? Like, what is the difference in regenerative design and sustainable design?
Yeah, so they're not opposites, which is actually super important, right?
Yeah.
Sustainability you could think of as let's do no harm. We can look at the Brundtland report, which I have trouble with the language that says we're not supposed to. This current generation meets its need without hindering the opportunity for future generations to meet their need. I don't like the word need, but even if we think of sustainability in terms of saying having a net carbon zero or things like that, that's sustainable. So this building that I'm in right now is probably sustainable. It's made of bamboo. Yeah, I had some carbon in terms of transportation, but ultimately it tries to minimize the impact. Regeneration is more on a continuum. So it starts to think differently about how we participate in the world. Now, I also think regeneration is a word that's being co-opted. I think
Yep.
it's also something that people are seeing in terms of healing, in terms of restoring, but I don't see regeneration in terms of healing. And that's because I worry that this idea of healing is trying to go back. Like there's a wound and we have to heal in order to go back to the status quo quote on status quo ante, that is how things were before. That's not it, because nothing ever goes back, right? We flow towards perpetual change. So it's not a question of healing. Regeneration is more the idea of working like nature works. And it's as simple as that. How does nature work? Nature, if we think about it, not as something that's out there, but as a process of enlivening, something that's been around for 3.8 billion years, it's absolutely perfect right now. And I don't mean this in a woo-woo way. I mean that it's perfect because nature understands and feels the signals of change and adapts immediately. It
Mm,
adapts immediately to find a state of homeostasis, that is a state of not equilibrium, but at least being able to have some kind of of balance. And in that sense, it's perfect because it is exactly where it needs to be right now, and it will change because it forever changes to something else. So regeneration is about working how nature works. If we erect a building, it's thinking, well, if this building wasn't here, what would happen?
mm.
You'd have jungle, you'd have fireflies, you'd have butterflies, you'd have snakes. So how might the building create conditions for those living things to thrive, really? And that's
Yeah.
regenerative processes. And that's really quite simple, but also tremendously complicated.
Yeah, totally. I think that already gets back to that one of those early questions, right? The creating conditions conducive to life. It's we're thinking about environments, school environments specifically in this conversation. I want to read a quote from something that you wrote recently on your blog. So bear with me as I read off this page. So it says, your words. What might regenerative practice look like in education? I use might, not does, because regeneration practice is not a model. It cannot be replicated because life cannot be replicated. Life emerges in its unique way through its responses to the specific conditions around it. Regenerative practice is based on principles, not rules. It cannot be planned, rather, it grows in spaces that provide the conditions for it to thrive, and so is life affirming. And then, ellipses, you go on to say, this disorients our notion of education because we no longer ask individuals to follow one linear path toward a predetermined goal. Rather, we rewild learning. In the wild, nothing can live on its own. Nonlinearity, complexity, biodiversity, this is what life needs to thrive, and these are the seeds of any regenerative practice. We are all, but not two. I love this, Benjamin. I think this is a really interesting and effective distillation of what regenerative practice looks like in education. I'm curious if you have anything you'd add to that before I go on to the a framework for regenerative practice that you actually outline in that same piece.
Yeah, and I think the only thing to really think about this is in terms of what place is. And place
Hmm.
isn't a physical location, a geographical location. It's something that comes about in this moment in time with all of the agents, human, other than human, non-human, that are in this moment, in this space time. And that's why the models, these IKEA boxes that we have in so many educational systems that try to replicate it, that do the same thing in Japan as they do in Chicago, that's nothing, nothing to do with regeneration. And if we continue to think about it in terms of those models of what might a regenerative system look like, how can I import it? We're already asking the wrong question.
Yeah. So, at risk of getting dangerously close to that question throughout this conversation, I want to go. You posit this framework for regenerative practice. And I kind of want to just drill into each of the three elements that you lay out and then ask you to kind of reflect on how you're living into this principle at your school. So, the first one is to create space for emergence. And I can give you more of your words if helpful, or feel free to kind of ad lib off of that.
So even this word, we talked about language at the beginning, we can use the word framework, but even framework means that it's fixed, right? So we're
Right.
just going to use it as an expediter here and
Fantastic.
understand each other that it's certainly an imperfect word. So emergence is this idea that's everything that happens in nature is emergent, right? It's a
Yep.
question of we talk about ecosystems. What really is an ecosystem is everything that's interdependent. I'm not even going to use the word interconnected because interconnected means that or it suggests that we have things that are connected to other things, where actually we emerge from our relationships.
Hmm.
The relationships comes first, and then whatever entities come out of it are secondary. So that's a different way of looking at it. So the interdependence, the emergence is we don't really know where it's going. We don't know when we plant a tree what it's going to look like. It emerges based on something that is internal to it, but also external factors. So
Hmm.
when education is emergent, we appreciate that everyone's an individual, yet we are also part of a human collective within a more than human, greater collective. And then there's other conditions like weather and like materiality and all of these things that create conditions that are unique. Every single one is unique. So it emerges because we never know where it goes. The
Hmm.
problem with a lot of education system is this linearity. I think, for instance, and we can get into this, like Portrait of a Graduate, like you're trying to get to this linear place without, not just without knowing, oh, we don't know what the future looks like, but without offering possibilities that the uniqueness of life will take on its own form that will never be fossilized in the moment. It will continue to go forward. So that's what emergence is. It's looking at it the other way that most educational system looks at, rather than looking for an outcome. How do we create conditions for us to thrive as individuals within a community of life forms?
I definitely want to keep tagging back into that kind of throughout this conversation. But can you give me an example of how you're living into this principle at your school? I'm sure you do it in a lot of different ways. So feel free to just pick one specific kind of scenario.
This week we have our capstones. So our capstones is our greenstones. I'm the adult in the room when it comes to these grade 12s who are presenting their capstones. So I have zero idea of what these things are going to look like.
Hmm.
One kid started off trying to do a wind turbine. He ended up doing a hydroelectric generator. I mean, okay, that might be simplifying things, but he just went with his learning. I could think of
Hmm.
other projects where we're saying, okay, we've got this problem that we're going to try to respond to, but we have no idea what it's going to look like. So we let the learning unfold on a basis of when we need it, how we need it, but the purpose or the intention is to respond to a local problem in order to create more positive conditions for all life. So that's how we emerge, which is completely different from saying preparing for a test. Now, there's nothing wrong with tests sometimes, but that's not the end. That's a means to take that knowledge and use it for other things.
Yeah. So something you said in there actually kind of surprises me, which is that you identified grade 12 as being still like the sign off point. In your to kind of live fully into these principles, the linearity of grades, I assume, would kind of have to go away as well. Is there a way to bake in that dynamism within the school to actually kind of give people permission to exit this kind of this place that you've made for them when they feel ready, when they've demonstrated readiness? Like, how do you think about that component?
That's such a good question. So we have capstones for grade 8, we have capstones for grade 5, and every grade has projects. So let's face it, we're still in a system where we have to think about what the world is outside. If we live too much in a bubble, then that's unrealistic. That doesn't
Right.
actually prepare. So there's a tension there. I'm also thinking that in our middle school, we have mixed age math classes. All our high school is mixed age as well. So we've got 9, 10, 11, 12s who are in the same classes, but they're still called grade 9, 10, 11 based on their age. Because of the way we work before graduation, we do have kids of all ages working together on some of these projects, not just in high school, but across middle school, high school, and primary school. I
Mm.
don't know if I'm really answering your question so much, but within the box we can play around. But unfortunately, we still live within a system where we have to get them a piece of paper that says that they've done such and such in terms of quality and quantity to be able to go out in the world.
Yeah, no, I think that what addresses my question well. I know it was a tough one, but I do think this living within contradictions is going to keep coming up today because you're basically trying to imagine a different system from within the one that you're currently in, which is kind of, and I think that that's sort of the tension of the Audre Lorde quote, right? It's the master's tools cannot dismantle the master's house, and yet all of us here are kind of toying with the levers within the system to try and adjust the system without really questioning the broader implications of like what is the system built to do. Like are you still participating in a meritocracy? Are you still participating in an extractive environment? So I just wanted to flag contradictions are going to come up a lot,
Mhm.
and that's totally okay. Let's go to the second piece of your sort of quote unquote framework, but yes, fully fluid, which actually works well because this principle is fluid and ever morphing. So give us a little bit about what that means to you, and then again, an example of kind of how y'all are leaning into this at the school.
So I really do appreciate this idea of contradiction. I think that when we talk about the biomimicry for regenerative design piece to it and what we're trying to do, it's a physical space, but it's also an approach to learning. And I
Hmm.
think that the contradictions are going to be fully there. And what's wonderful about regeneration is, unlike sustainability is a destination, regeneration is a process. And that's also a very important point. We could
Hmm.
get to net zero. That's a destination. We stake there. Whereas regeneration, because it is how nature works, it never stops. So the contradictions, we're always implicated. We're entangled in this world. I mean, shoot, I took a car to get here, right? I've got lights on. We're never going to be completely clean, and because there's no such thing as purity, there's no such thing as being clean. So I think that once we give up these ideas of black and white, good and evil systems, even this idea of the system is broken is a false narrative that we need to consider. But the biomimicry for regenerative design lab is really trying to open up dialogue with every member of the community, and that's human and other than human, and trying to understand, if we're going to work like nature work, how might we include the voices of that community? How might we consider the big questions that, while they can't be replicated elsewhere, might provoke, might stimulate others to ask the same questions? How we might consider products. I don't like the word solution, but I'll use it here anyway. Solutions or non-material things to work like nature works, be it in the way we communicate, the way we govern, the way we organize. How might we do that in ways that take into account the interests of not just humans or the student, but all living things now and later on? So the question that we ask might be, what would a firefly think of this building in 2050? Those are very important questions. What might the
Hmm.
river think? I know the river is not a living thing, but we'll just take it as a place where there's so many living things. And then of course storytelling, which is the most important in my view, is like, how do we influence others, and how might we let ourselves be influenced by others?
Hmm.
So it's just a different way of thinking from, say, design thinking, which starts with like empathy with the user. It doesn't even start with like getting to know who we are, right? It starts automatically with empathy. It doesn't even start with our own positionality or situatedness. But
Interesting.
it's so linear. It's about user. It's about like, how might we solve a problem? Whereas regenerative design is, how might we take into account all those externalities? How might we take into account how our actions will affect other life forms that we might not take into account? So we try to break out of that linearity and more like draw a bunch of messy little diagrams
Hmm.
and connections there, and then erase them and draw them again.
I think I just finished the "Is a River Alive" by Robert McFarlane. He may disagree, that he may say a river is alive.
Fair enough.
So,
That's fair enough. I I
um,
can totally get that. Yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. No, I am. I think we were riffing kind of in the margins of your blog, but you laid out this really useful design process, which I want to get to in this conversation, the four S's, and I talked about those as kind of being almost this like three-dimensional layer to design thinking, whereas design thinking is kind of already linear, but really they say it's iterative in a circle, despite how it's usually pictured. But this almost just turns like a circle into a sphere, right? Like you're suddenly going on these new axes, and all the like time becomes a time, self, like probably ancestors, like all these things become really viable axes with which to design, and takes it away from just like this linear you to user kind of point of view. So I just wanted to kind of double click on that piece. I think that's really useful. You've given one example already of the student that pivoted their project, which is fluid and morphing, but based on that design principle, like, can you give another example of something that you're doing in the school that is fluid and ever morphing?
Yeah, and I'd just like to just really quick respond to the design thinking. Yeah, it does
Yeah,
go in a circle, but ultimately you're still trying to solve a user problem. And a lot of
correct.
the times there's a morality thing about like, how might we sell something? But so we pivot all the time. I mean, we do things that sometimes just don't go anywhere, and we're okay with that. Failure is huge here, huge, because that's something that we celebrate. I'll give you another example of how we've pivoted. I've got a student here who, let's say, another capstone project. He wanted to work on, say, for instance, he wanted to create a book of soundscapes of Bali and take pictures.
Mm.
He's a photographer. He wanted to do soundscapes. He wanted to really capture the aliveness. But and it was going to be like some kind of interactive experience where you walk through a gallery and you hear the birds and you see them, and it's going to be something super artistic. I mean, that was, it just didn't happen. It
Yeah.
simply didn't happen. And that's okay. But then we started to think about like maybe it's not about the experience that you provide other people, but maybe it's about the stories that you tell about why that was so challenging, or maybe it was about like, might we just tell the stories of the birds in different ways?
I think that it actually is a pretty good example, because what it does is, and this is something that I'm kind of personally obsessed with is it takes the focus away from the product and puts it back on the
Mhm,
process,
mhm,
which is really, as you've said, that's the best way to stay regenerative and not necessarily sustainable. Like
mhm,
it's this kind of dance you're always doing where at Getting Smart, I'm always thinking about how are we telling stories of process rather than product. In
mhm,
education, you're working on like 20-year time horizons to see if anything
mhm,
quote unquote worked. And by then, usually the finish line has moved a little bit further and it's like, oh well, I guess it didn't work. And you're like, I don't know, like something just like we have AI now. Like something
yeah.
just changed. So I just wanted to make sure like that is a good example because I think it really does emphasize process in a way that's super useful. So
And you know what? I'm getting caught in my own trap. It's so hard to break out of like these things have to be dazzling and in order to impress the listeners or the viewers or things like that. So we get caught like this is something that's so baked in. We
yeah.
don't take into account or we don't pause on maybe the simplicity that all we said was fine, let's do something else. And maybe that's really complex. Maybe
Mm.
that's where the beauty is, right? So this goes back to the whole theme of this is like these contradictions and how we're not looking for solutions. There's no black and white. We are soiled inside and out with what the dominant narrative is has baked into our bodies and our minds for the last X amount of years. You're absolutely right to point that out.
Well, thanks. But I also hope our listeners are impressed. So, to lean again into contradiction, I want to get to your last piece of this, again, kind of unframework. It's this idea of being pluricentric. And this is one that I grapple with a lot because we're talking about both human centered design a lot, which has some implications about how we view everything else, as well as we talk about personalized learning a lot. And you've a couple of times now kind of gestured at the idea that if you create an environment that doesn't have outcomes, you can let people really lean in and find their own individual pathway. But I'm always grappling with this tension of the me and the we. Like, how do you actually design an environment that celebrates achievement, growth, synergy among like a collective cohort of people? And what does that, I guess, what does that mean to you? What does that bring up for you? And how do you embrace that at your school?
So this is really thanks for asking this question because this is something that really I've been thinking a lot about and I could feel it in my body that I get excited about talking about this. So this is where it gets this is where we talk about systems change and
Yeah.
the question that's out there that we can respond to maybe a little bit later is like the system isn't broken. It just depends like who's it working for and who's it not. Like let's look at it in more complex terms. But I am fully 100% wanting to challenge this idea of student centric, learner centric. I think that we have moved so far beyond this. At least we should, if we want to respond to ecological breakdown. That's the first thing to do. Now, a lot of people are going to move towards student centric, and that's a great move because it's like it's master control of being up in front and telling people what to do. We move towards student centric. That's a positive step. And at the risk of sounding a bit like I don't mean to sound disparaging that, but really, if we move forward, so I shouldn't say move forward because that brings up linearity. But if we move beyond student centric and we could put life centric, not human centric, life centric, because student centric still individualizes, it still atomizes, it still separates us from others, including humans, of course, but life. It still says that we're going to make sure that the student comes first and that we're going to do everything we can to ensure that whatever the achievement is in us. I mean, put in whatever you want. It doesn't it doesn't consider us, our position, our situatedness within the web of life. And that's the fundamental change. Because ultimately we respond by putting students first by no longer giving tests and working on competencies and things like that. But that's just the same thing. This is what I mean by change without change. We talk about competency and cultivating creativity and critical thinking and communication, all that stuff, but it doesn't mean anything. Like what is communication? Like some of the greatest tyrants of the 20th centuries were great communicators, very creative, and superb collaborators. Is that
Mm.
what we want? Like those are means to an end. What is the end? The end is where we get towards life centric. Now, calling it life centric doesn't mean that you throw the learner away, the young person. You just make it, as you said, pluricentric. So they are part of this web of life, this soup of life, and they matter. But so do the spiders, so do you, so do all the other living things on the planet. It's about taking those means, all those competencies and skills, and applying them towards the greater good. Now, the greater good, I'm using it with like all the knowledge of like, that's a complicated thing. But if we think about moving towards regenerative practices, is what might create the conditions conducive to life. And so our learning doesn't exist in isolation. Our learning is applied to something that creates the conditions for life.
Hmm.
There's no point in learning. So that's like potential energy, but we transform it into kinetic energy, and we learn in order to leave a positive mark on others, on the non-human world. That's where it becomes quite different. And that's where moving away from student-centric is a way to rethink of who and what and why we are.
Hmm.
That's critically different from other notions in education of like trying to change a system, but we're actually just doing the same thing, which is creating nice little compliant consumers who get jobs and are benefit from a system like you said earlier about the meritocratic system.
Is there a version of this that you could even transfer to, say you're a classroom in a semi-traditional school, but the actual, like, you make students accountable to each other and their own sort of development of learning and the performance, quote unquote. Like, I wonder how we might. I've told this story on the podcast before, but like, and it's kind of a not super great example, but I went to a rowing class one time in my life, and I do not go to exercise classes. I usually do it alone. And the thing that really struck me about this specific class is the leaderboard at the front is one number, and it's the cumulative distance the class has rowed. And so they say, we're going to try to reach this number. And then everybody pushes, and then that number grows at the rate of the whole room. And I'm really fascinated by what that would actually look like in a classroom setting where it's like, how do we actually lift all of our sort of interrelations within that room up at the same time? And then I feel like that becomes something you can apply to the other than human world, right? Like you can begin to apply that elsewhere and try to lift everything up. So I don't know if any of that resonates, but I'm curious how you think about this kind of even within just the human lens.
Yeah, so I love that. And we can move to that. So let's take your rowing class. You have
Yep.
a number that's going out there. Now imagine if you had, I don't know, a video of a building being lit up and maybe something else so that the energy that you produce actually creates a different environment for, say, a family or something that doesn't need to get electricity or whatever. So
Love that.
that's actually a very important change because when we think of assessment, that dirty word, but assessment, and I mean that in the broadest way of how might we look at the quality of learning or the quality of an artifact that is presented,
Mm,
because it's not even the quality of learning, it's the quality of the artifact that's presented. So often we're looking at it in isolation. But if the learning is about contributing to life, it's actually, we're more interested or it's more valuable to hear from those who have benefited or those who have been impacted, those who have been affected by the learning, or should I say, how the learning was transformed into doing for others. So I'll give you an example. I'm just making it up, but so they learn about the solar panel, they learn about the physics, they made it, it's fantastic. Now, in many systems, we would say, okay, does it work? Right. And we look at it, we look at components, it aesthetically pleasing, does it work? But really, the important thing is how might the people who have benefited from this solar panel, what would they say? How,
mm,
how, how did Mason's contribution benefit them? And having those testimonials about how our learning has improve somebody's life, that's really where the value is. I'll give you another example. For instance, the hydroelectric generator I mentioned earlier, it's not about the hydroelectric generator is when it's hooked up to a wire that makes it so that a farmer has electricity and doesn't have to steal from the electric grid, which is what's happening now in Bali. How has their life improved? That's really what we're looking at. And so it opens us up to, it's not about me. It's about what others might say and how I've benefited them. If we think of that in a school, we could take our learning, turn it into something, and really appreciate how much that has contributed to other life forms. And that's where that sphere that you mentioned comes into play because we collect the voices at the beginning, we collect the voices at the end, understanding that there is no beginning, no end because it's perpetual. And that's when we start to say, okay, the quality of our learning and doing is high or positive, whatever you want to say, or certainly opens the gateway and is life centered. And that's it's changed from a lot of the assessments now about have you demonstrated communication, which means nothing. It means
mm.
nothing. What has your communication done in order to make the world better?
So at Getting Smart, we think a lot about learning models. And early in the in your writing, you sort of called out models as a thing that is sort of non-emergent by nature because you're putting definitions on it, you're putting all these things. I think we have a bias toward models and like society does due to scaling. Like it makes it much easier to scale a concept if you've created a model and then you can continue to use it. So I guess the question's twofold, and you can answer both or one or whatever. One is, how does nature scale? Like, if it's fully emergent, what does scale actually mean in sort of an ecological sense? And or two, are there pieces of a model that you can hold on to in order to scale sort of like the scaffolding for one of these ideas? Or do you have to really throw it all out and just go with this sort of like raw kinetic energy?
Yeah, no, that's the real challenge, isn't it? And the beautiful thing about regenerative practice is that there are no answers. And people say, well, what would this look like? And I have to say, I have no idea, because
Yeah.
that's what emergence is. Nature doesn't scale. Nature is different in every piece, because what goes on with that tree over there that I'm looking at that you might not be able to see, and that tree over there is completely different. There's only maybe, I don't know, 20 meters between them,
Mm,
but everything that happens in this is different. It's a different trees, different animals in the ground, different critters, different everything. If we take it more fractally, like if we zoom out, we can maybe see what patterns emerge. And
mm,
patterns, of course, is different from scale. And then we can look at the patterns that are there and kind of make generalities out of what those might look like. But that's different from scaling. Those are just saying, okay, let's see what that is. And nature does adapt to patterns, and we can think about it in terms of that. So when we think about models, I guess the problem with the word model is, like, if we have this IKEA box set where we're going to take one curriculum, put it here, and then another, and then that same curriculum, put it there, and expect the same outcome, then we're just standardizing the whole thing, right? I mean,
mm.
standardization came literally in the Industrial Revolution when they made replaceable machine parts. I mean, let's really look at where that word came from, right? Standardize also the railway, the distance between the rail tracks, so that you can get things from one state or one country to another. So we can be inspired, and we can have the same approach. Now, if that's just a fancy word for model, maybe, but an approach is like how you come to something. You approach someone, you approach something, but you
Yeah.
don't really know what's going to happen with that encounter. And it's the moment of encounter that matters. So we can approach with the same disposition, the same thoughts, the same feelings. You talked about poetry. Moving is also an embodied experience, right? It's not just in our head. So we can
Of
approach it
course.
that way, but the encounter with the experience will change every single time. And that's where the emergence comes in.
Mm,
So if I were to take, so it's the bird lap at Green School Bali. Now, the dream is to have one in the most urban of settings, because it's easy to do it in the jungle, or at least people think it is. But if you have it in an urban setting, you have regenerative design in an urban setting. Now we're really talking.
mm.
But it's never going to be the same thing. But it might be the same approach.
And the Bird Lab, just to make the connection, the Bird
That's right.
Lab is the biomimicry for regenerative design
That's right.
lab. Okay.
That's right.
Yes. Great.
So that's where we start to consider different ways of having these encounters with life, as life,
Mhm.
appreciating that it comes from place, which, again, as we talked about earlier, is something that emerges from this moment in time with these actors and agents in this moment in time, and that's going to be every time unique and emergent. And I think that, again, it's like, this is all we can go into, like, all, like, the physics of it that I don't understand, but there's, like, it's not woo woo is what I'm trying to say. Like there's actual, this is in hard science, as I use air quotes. But if we think about what that might mean, it's not about replication, it's about being inspired, and it's about
Mm.
adapting, just like we talked about some of these kids that had to adapt based on the circumstances that they face.
You go into this in detail in the blog you submitted for us about the four S's design principle, but you've already brought up storytelling. I love storytelling as like a key principle of this. Can you give the listeners just like a quick summary of kind of what is this 4S approach, to use the word you were just using, and how might they start to think about it within their own kind of school setting?
This is what I think is beautiful, and I have to give credit to Andy Middleton and Denise DeLuca, who are really the thinkers and architects behind this. The 4S approach is one that is intended to be able to be used by a 5-year-old and by a 99-year-old, by someone who's not in school, someone who's got whatever post engineer, whatever you want, like super
Yeah.
specialist. Because the idea of sensing is just to feel, to sense, that is, like, what's going on. And that's when we start to like consider how might we respond to, or how might we want to change the trajectory of what's happening. So let's give a concrete example. Let's say kids let's say we need a playground. We need a different play space. So that's, we kind of sensing, okay, community is saying we need different kind of play space. So what might that look like? So when you design a playground and you sense, you collect the voices of all living things. So not just the children, but the teachers who have to be there and monitor, the parents. What about the butterflies and the birds and the trees? What might a tree think of this playground? I brought up earlier the Firefly 2050. What might they think? What might, for instance, a Balinese kid in 2125 think of it? What might a Balinese kid in 1925 think of this playground if we think about preserving culture? So collecting those voices and those perspectives, I know there's like the visible thinking routine, like circle of perspective. We can think about it that way. Some call it council of all beings. And we try to understand exactly where we are with this.
Hmm.
And then we ask the big question: what would happen if we designed a playground that took into account all life, that was compostable, and that met like that did what we want, which is, I don't know, let's just say gave sensory experiences to children as they played. So that's the sensing part and the seeking part of those questions that we might ask that are bigger questions. It's not just about how do we design a playground, it's how might we design a playground that might work in place, but also be an inspiration to others. Then shaping, so that's sensing, seeking, that we're at shaping, is how might nature, how does nature create play spaces? All mammals play. How is it that mammals play in certain areas? What do they need? How might we think about ways that the playground itself might be compostable? It might create some shade, but at the same time, not so much shade that maybe there's like bugs that are there, because there's nothing wrong with bugs, but maybe we don't want to create an area where there might like have a beehive right over there. But at the same time, we want to provide food for some of the birds. So we're just looking at what that ecosystem might look like with that playground, just as if the playground wasn't there. And then the storytelling is about saying, hey, this is where we are. We're sharing this with the world, and how might we inspire? Now let's take that to, if you took a class where you had 5 different groups, they would storytell about their playground, and then they're gonna like take ideas from others. So your playground might have some things that I think are really cool, and I'm gonna magpie and take that and redesign my playground. But you're not gonna think I'm stealing from you. You're gonna be really, really happy and thrilled that your idea has made it into mine, because that's regenerative. And then we go back and we go back to sensing as well. And of course, this isn't linear. We can jump from one to the other, but it is these ideas. We have these four different phases of the approach to design.
I really like that. I think that's a really useful and novel framework to get people to think a little differently and to think bigger and to include more perspective. Something that I love in this conversation, Benjamin, is we are gesturing at designing a new system, basically, rather than just kind of working within the one we currently are in. But some of the things you're saying actually I see examples of them in classrooms kind of across the country in a way that's really positive. Like the shift to project base, the way that so much of what you described does this project have a positive impact on others? Like that's the community connected projects that we're seeing pop up. There's like this posture towards curiosity, this approach of curiosity. That is something that I do think is embedded in certain POGs, like whether or not it's actually going to manifest long term and whether or not that is like the correct way to actually message that. I think people are starting to think about some of those things. So I guess I'm throwing all this in there because I do think, and as you alluded to earlier, you are still kind of working within this grade based system. They have to get into 12th grade to leave, and you had to give them a piece of paper. My takeaway from you is that, like, take a look at where you are now, and there's basically always more room to go. And so, like, don't like get over the patting yourself on the back moment. Really just keep moving in service of life. And that is kind of what ed leaders can do in this challenging meta crisis moment that we're all in. Would you say that that's a sufficient distillation and kind of fire under the ed leader, or how would you continue to push it?
I hope so. And there's so many different entry points here in different areas that it's what makes it so incredibly hard and so incredibly easy at the same time.
Yeah.
Napoleon probably didn't say this, but apocryphically, he's supposed to have said, like, don't be so far ahead of your troops that they mistake you for the enemy. And that's a
Oh,
lot
yeah.
of what goes on here. Like, we can't go out and be like complete crazies, because that's what we're going to be seen in. And we could talk about overage and windows shifting and all that stuff, but ultimately it has to be relatable and doable. And that's what's so beautiful about the approach about conducive to life, is that's really what the North Star is. Are we creating conditions conducive to life? The challenge is getting us away from this idea of assessing student learning based on the product, even on the process. Although I do like process, but really thinking about the impact that it has on others and how it has created those conditions, and collecting the voices of others, the testimonials. So if I go, for instance, on and we do this in real, like outside of school. If you go to get a haircut or a photographer or anything, they always have a testimonials page,
Yeah.
right? We do this all the time. You go use an Uber, the guy has, or woman has 3 stars. You're not going to be as happy as if it's 5. So we already do this. Our resumes are built so that we aren't saying, oh, I am a great communicator. That means nothing, but it's, I have been able to lead conferences that have led to something, or increase sales, or whatever it is that people might use in terms of their metrics. It's in schools, we somehow have this problem that we just assess the product for the product's sake rather than how it goes. And I think it's because we're so afraid to embrace values. We're so afraid to go beyond this objectivity and non-bias and all this malarkey. So leaders can do this, leaders can push this, but of course we're all in a system where schools get funding based on their test results, right? And that goes back to what you were saying at the very beginning, and all these things that constrain us. But I want to go back to this important point about the system is broken. That's a false narrative. The system's doing exactly what it needs to do, because it's reproducing good little consumers who are compliant, many of which don't really have critical thinking. Because if we were really serious about critical thinking, the whole system would go down, because people realize that this is actually we don't want to. It's working very well for those kids who are getting into Harvard because their dad or mom got into Harvard because they were able to afford this and that tutoring. It's working great for those guys. It's working great for the people who are just a little bit better than the people under them. And I'm using this in terms of a hierarchy. So it's about how might we change. The system's always changing. There's no one system that needs to change. Every day, the system is changing. But how might we influence the trajectory and the momentum? How might we accelerate towards where we might want to go, that horizon? And that's those very small things. Listeners who are educators, when they go in the classroom or any classroom, I bet you most of them have that big oak desk at the front of the room. And then the tables, maybe they're done in a horseshoe, whatever, but there's still those symbols of power. Throw that desk away. Create a circle and sit at the table in the circle with the other students. Don't call them students, call them learners. We're all learners. That's how you start to every day, like, kind of challenge where we are right now, by asking questions, by being vulnerable, by saying, hey, do something else. Fine, you failed, moving on. And then, of course, we could do the bigger resistance pieces, which is to open up dialogue and say, actually, this doesn't work out. Let's actually talk about class. That's another thing that we can talk about, right? That we never talk about class anymore,
Yeah,
right?
never.
So all those different resistance points that we can do, can sabotage what's existing. And I love this idea of sabotage. Maybe that's what we need to do, but without trying to fix it, more like trying to open up those gaps that are already there.
Yeah, I think you and also Will Richardson gesture this idea of hospicing it as well, right? Like, you sabotage hospice. It's something that has an actual terminus and it is not intended to be brought back. But you could do that with care. You could do it with sabotage, which I don't actually know the root of that word, but I assume it's a little bit more, at least mischievous. So I love that. This question of what would it mean for a school system to create conditions conducive to life, I think I want folks to sit with that and really think about it and kind of evaluate their own school system within that question, and just sit with it for a bit, because nobody is really doing this. I'm so grateful for the ways that you've continued to shape my thinking over the years through LinkedIn and otherwise. Any final words for our listeners before we jump off today?
Yeah, Mason, I want to apologize without apologizing for all the background noise that's here, right? And I know that in most podcasts we have to have like these studio conditions, but this is what this is life, right? This is authentic. This is the environment we're in. We have no walls. We have like birds and people and everything like that. And those imperfections that are there that might kind of jar us and make us feel uncomfortable, I think is also part of it. And saying, screw it. This is what it's like. And all the messiness, learning experiences inside, outside the classroom, the way we wake up, if we're in a bad mood, we just embrace that. And that's a wonderful way to break models, to appreciate that the messiness is part of the emergence, and we should absolutely love it.
Great ending note. Benjamin Freud, thank you so much for being here today.
Awesome. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in to the Getting Smart podcast today. We want this podcast to be actionable, insightful, and a great way to learn about what's next in learning. In order to stay on the cutting edge, we need people in the field to tell us what they're hearing, what they're wanting, and what they're needing to learn more about. Got a topic or a guest in mind? Send your recommendations to me, Mason at gettingsmart.com. And if you like what you're hearing, don't forget to leave a review in Apple Podcasts or subscribe wherever you listen. Feel free to share the podcast on social media using the hashtag GSPodcasts. Thanks so much.